Welcome to Roadkill Politics, the show that explores alternative political viewpoints and searches for truth in government. Now your hosts, Al Price and Jim Ananick.
Good evening. Welcome to another edition of Roadkill Politics. My co-host Jim Ananick on my right, and on my left is our guest for this evening, and he is Paul Peterson, who is a professor of philosophy at the University of Michigan-Flint. First thing I want to do is sort of acknowledge some of the local accuracy in the press. We spent a lot of time beating up on the Flint Journal, and it seems that, at least for once, they actually got it right where they did our story on roadkill politics, and showing correctly Jim smacking himself in the side of the head at the beginning of the show, which he has now adopted as his standard format. So we do want to acknowledge when they do get things right, because normally we don't like the Journal all that much, but when they do something that's good.
Jack Miner's mad at you.
Jack Miner is. Well, then, the problem is they immediately go and do something bad again, because then the Journal started beating up on Darrell Buchanan about why he should let the council alone and just go away quietly. So even when they do something right, they immediately counter that with something wrong again.
The Journal believes we should get rid of the Supreme Court too, though, because they just mess everything up. You know.
Well, that does seem about the same analysis. Anyway, they did get one right, and we wanted to acknowledge that as part of our fairness doctrine here.
Anyway, if they say nice things about us, they get it right.
That's the only possible interpretation, that they did get it right because they said something nice about us. Other things in the news, following up on stories we did or talked about in the past, Oakland County is still wasting taxpayers' money by prosecuting Kevorkian for common law assisted suicide. They failed under the statutory law, so now they're going to make up a crime that doesn't exist.
Why don't they prosecute the cigarette companies for assisted suicide?
Common law assisted suicide. Yeah. They should. If they're going to go with common law stuff, I thought statutory law superseded common law because nobody knows exactly what common law is.
No, they like that. That sounds like the city council.
Well, and then that's the second one I wanted to bring up. City council is still going after Darrell Buchanan. Hundreds of thousands of dollars later, they're beating up Darrell Buchanan for mismanaging his office. And as far as I can tell, they mismanaged the city, so why don't they go away quietly too?
I mean, we ought to hold a hearing. They're guilty, you're out. Take care of that. We got a new council coming in.
We're going to appoint them.
Yeah.
Anyway,
we'll keep Peggy Cook and we'll keep Matt Taylor.
Well, they're the only two who haven't been in on it.
Usually when I talk about the council, I'm not referring to those two anyway.
Yeah, we do sort of do a blanket indictment. Well, that was enough of sort of spontaneity about the news. Now we're going to talk about the topic we actually set out to talk about. And that is a course that you taught this last semester and you were scheduled to teach, but I guess it didn't work out, but are going to teach again in the fall. Mm-hmm. And that is the Rhetoric of Hate and Fear.
Yep, it's a new course, Rhetoric of Hate and Fear. It's a course that I created this year, largely in response to the bombing of the federal building in Oklahoma City last year. I offered it for the first time last fall, and I just finished teaching it again this winter. And I'm going to give it a rest over the summer and then teach it again next fall.
Well, it seems like this is an appropriate time for it because this last weekend was actually the anniversary of that bombing.
Yes. Yeah.
And that was the anniversary of the Waco, whatever you want to call it, disaster where they burned up the kids. And also this year,
those children.
Where they killed the children. And this year, massacred. And this year is the NRA's national convention that they say just coincidentally came up on the anniversary of those two events, which I find to be slightly difficult to believe, that they planned that 5 years in advance.
Well, I'm sure glad they put that Unabomber away. They got him convicted and put away real quick.
Well, maybe. Because we don't really know for sure yet.
Well, basically, I've seen all the evidence in the newspaper, so he must be already convicted and tried. And the jury said he was guilty.
Well, he was a mathematician. So, and at Berkeley for a while.
That explains it.
But is there something that, I mean, obviously the bombing was an event, But is there something you're seeing about the nature of civil discourse or something happening that lead, because you don't do this easily, you just develop a new course. You did it in response to not just an event, but what else?
Well, I saw this as an opportunity to focus on actual events that are in the news, events that stir up a lot of emotions, and at the same time bring to bear a philosophical understanding of these events through the idea of rhetoric.
That already loses a lot of people.
Yeah,
what
yeah.
Are you talking about?
Well, rhetoric is another one of those terms that
lost me.
that had a nice beginning with Aristotle, but has now come to have lots of different uses, many of them pejorative. When someone says that's just rhetoric or that's empty rhetoric, it's a way of suggesting that there's something suspect about what somebody says. The Republican Congress is waxing rhetoric all the time, for example. Rush Limbaugh engages in rhetoric all the time. But when rhetoric was created by Aristotle, generally the idea of rhetoric is people think of rhetoric as effective use of language. Usually it's associated with speech, so effective speech. Aristotle thought of that as a use of language that brings one to understand the truth. But that certainly isn't the way rhetoric is understood nowadays. Nowadays, people think of rhetoric as more the art of persuasion, persuading someone to your point of view. And persuasion does not necessarily mean bringing someone to see the truth. So we've lost the element of truth that Aristotle was most concerned with.
But there is something related to it, even in the rhetoric of the people who are kind of off on the lunatic fringe. Because, you know, we're talking about, as we speak, the Freemen are holed up in Montana, declaring themselves free of the country and having a new country. Unabomber, as you were suggesting, who's also from Montana, is...
We got a letter from Montana.
We got a fan letter.
We'll open it later.
But this...
Better be careful.
This sort of notion is occurring, but generally, instead of a search for the truth, it seems to me that there is an extraction or an expansion from a kernel of truth. And so they take something that has some validity to it and then expand it to a lunatic
Yes, that
proportion.
happens quite a bit. But not only that, there's been this one diminution in the notion of rhetoric from Aristotle's idea of the truth to persuasion, but in contemporary, a good deal of contemporary political ideology, rhetoric has taken a further dive to the point of not even being so much concerned with persuasion as being concerned with simply a kind, what I call affirmation, a kind of declaration of one's own point of view in the most extravagant way that one can think of, without caring about whether one really is persuading anyone else. And so what we tend to see is preaching to the converted, people who say things that they like to hear and fellow thinkers like to hear, and it turns everyone else off. And that's a good deal of what's happening with rhetoric nowadays. People are really just speaking to their own converts and not trying to convert anyone else.
And so it's not a process of discourse, it's a process of exclamation.
Yeah, exactly, yeah, a kind of venting, but in a kind of social way. It's almost ceremonial in a sense. It's almost like a religious act. Getting together and declaring these things and applauding, and in some cases maybe even laughing about it, as you see in a lot of the talk shows.
That's what we want to do.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, why did we bring him on to make fun of our show?
Yeah,
Time for you to leave.
you're making use of that.
That's what you said we were going to do when you called me.
Well, I didn't know he was going to tell us we're bad.
Okay, what else are we doing wrong?
That idea, though, of what's wrong with taking that and beating up on somebody else.
Well, it's certainly an honored tradition in politics.
Yeah.
What you see, of course, going on in America right now is taking a particularly mean-spirited form. Even beyond what we've seen in the past. And it's there have always been currents in American thinking that have inclined people toward conspiracy theories and toward disillusionment with the government.
I believe almost all of them. Almost any conspiracy, I'll believe.
Yeah, well, do you believe
How about
that...
you?
He's an FBI.
He's going to inform on us?
Yeah.
So do you believe that the devil is behind world history?
Pretty much.
Maybe
The devil did it.
If you look at the results. Well, but I mean, it doesn't take much when you... I remember when who was the guy who... Lyndon LaRouche was claiming that the world was dominated by an international drug conspiracy, and it was Henry Kissinger, the Queen of England, and somebody else. And well, England did have 2 wars on China for opiums. I mean, there is a kernel of truth somewhere in this stuff, even if it's goofy. I mean, there does. I don't believe much in that. I mean, the devil stuff, but there does seem to be something that's vile and evil about an awful lot of what people do in the world. That may not be conspiratorial, but...
Well, I think the conspiratorial thinking begins with a desire to attribute volition to bad things that happen.
Well, they don't just happen by accident, do they? I mean, when they line up people by the millions in soldier suits and tell them to kill each other, it's just not an
That
accident.
certainly is volition.
They didn't just sort of all happen to end up in the same place.
But also people just screw up a lot. Human beings have a propensity to mess things up, to make mistakes.
So, yeah, it could be just badly done.
Yeah, mistakes aren't necessarily something evil that was planned by someone. It's quite often something that has gone wrong. The initial intent might not have been that good either, but it doesn't mean that what actually resulted was intended. The Waco fiasco is an example of that. A lot of people are upset about what happened in Waco, and rightfully so. But it's one thing to be...
Well, doesn't that make the kind of right-wing wackos seem kind of reasonable? When they say... And the newspaper did the same thing where they said, oh, they were molesting children there. Well, how do you know you burned them all up? How are you going to find out?
That evidence is gone.
Well, the evidence is gone, but I mean, if they were molesting children there, that's bad. But it's worse to kill them.
Sure.
So if molesting's them bad, burning them up seems worse.
Yeah. The question is, though, whether killing them was something that was intended. Was that a deliberate plan on the part of someone like the government or the UN to
The UN,
kill them?
Well, what about like with the Unabomber? I mean, joking around earlier. I mean, the federal government list everything that they find in this place.
But and
The first
I think
time-
your address was.
Yeah, my address on there, so I'm glad they cut it. But also, I remember the few times when it came out. At first, he was all scraggly and everything. Then they let him kind of shave up.
Yeah.
Then the next time, he came out with this orange jump prison suit on with a sport coat on.
So he doesn't look nuts
So
enough.
he doesn't look like he's really a prisoner, you know. Now, all the chains all over his hands and feet had, nothing to do with it. But sometimes you wonder if that's not setting it up, so that they can get their grand jury to do what they want their
certainly,
grand jury
certainly.
to do.
They always do
there's
that.
an
They want
intent
somebody to look
there.
dangerous. Bring him on an orange jumpsuit, manacled at the waist. They look like, hell, he can't even let him loose in the courtroom. He'll
Yeah,
kill somebody.
sure.
Yeah, there's no question about that. But I think also it's there is something right about that also, to the extent that it's an effort to humanize these people, to make them seem to be human beings rather than evil demons. I think there's a tendency, again, I think this is especially so nowadays, to want to demonize our foes and to regard them as something less than human.
Yeah. So where's the problem here? That's what we're going to say. That's our whole point. The evil empire's messing with us.
Well, I have a feeling that you dwell more in the range of evil ideas or evil thinking. I mean, I think
Well,
you can,
but sometimes
you can
it
attack
does-
the thinking.
But it looks conspiratorial when Congress says, okay, we'll create the Maquiadora zone and give tax breaks to companies who move there. Then the companies move there and finance Congress. That seems like people got together and said, I got an idea. These people have too much stuff in the United States. Maybe we can break their unions and get more of the stuff for us. That seems like somebody thought that out. Doesn't seem like an accident. You hear a lot about this, well, it's the world market. We got to compete in the world market. Well, you're not competing. You're controlling the Mexican government. You're controlling this government.
You know, I think certainly. I don't deny that there are conspiracies. There are certainly conspiracies.
And even paranoids have real enemies. I've seen that
Yes.
on
yes,
T-shirts.
That's right.
So it must be true.
Well, paranoia is just a heightened state of awareness.
Well, that certainly has gotten me paranoid, because now you've just dumped on the whole point of this TV show.
Well, I think you have to pick and choose your enemies in a way. I mean, there's this kind of careless attribution of conspiracy, which has the effect of losing your credibility. I'm not saying you are.
Present company accepted. Well, I've been told many times that I don't have credibility anyway. I remember when we were opposing the vote on the airport because it was going to create 11,000 jobs, and somebody took me aside and said, you're losing your credibility. We opposed Auto World, we opposed Water Street, we opposed the airport. All these things failed, and then they tell us we're losing our credibility. But the people who did it get to keep their credibility.
Because we didn't think they'd have all these airplanes flying into the airport.
Well, now you can't get jet service anywhere except charters to Las Vegas, which is okay, I guess, if you want to do that. But I don't know. Maybe we lost our credibility. And when did the CIA put you up to this point?
Well, you see, you went and blew your credibility, so now you can't persuade us anymore.
Well, I'm sorry for goofing on this somewhat, but the topic that you're talking about in your course is real, though, in that the people are taking it not as humorous rhetoric, as we're kind of goofing on it, but we are taking it from the perspective that we do sort of believe that there is real information that has to be disseminated. But these groups are taking portions of information and then indoctrinating their followers to do crazy things, it seems to me. I mean, the Freemen are an example where they're claiming that they can just pull out of the country and say, okay, we got a new country here now. After, although again, it's the government information, after they use phony money to get the land and then claim the courts have no jurisdiction.
That's what the Indians said.
Well, that's actually what the English did. Said, we got a piece of paper, so we own your land now.
I think I printed out this stuff. It says here.
So this has been done before.
Sure. I don't understand why anybody's upset. It's
That's the same way Columbus took the country. He showed up with a piece of paper, said the Queen gave me this.
You see, we set up our own, bank system and everything, and the Indians were just sitting there watching us, and then we started killing them all when they said, well, we kind of object to your system. And the problem with the Freemen, there's just not enough of them.
Well,
I mean, not saying they're right or anything,
no,
but
picking
I mean, if
Montana
there was like 100 million of them, they'd just start shooting us when we went over there.
picking Montana as a place to organize is sort of a bad strategy. If you want to organize, get a lot of people, you got to pick a big city.
I'd probably give them Montana if they really wanted it.
I think it's in the nature of something like the Freemen that they have to be a small group. I mean, if there were 1 million of them, they wouldn't be the Freemen anymore. They'd have a government, and
Well, that's more than voted in any of the last presidential elections.
yeah. But the Freemen, in their very nature, have to be a rather small group in order to be disaffected in that way, to be not a part of anything. So I think if you had 1 million, then you wouldn't have the Freemen.
I thought you said 100 million, just 1 million.
100.
Well,
You know what they ought to do every time the FBI comes in? They ought to give them blankets with smallpox on it.
Well, I was thinking about this, and it seems to me that the FBI shouldn't be involved in this at all. It should be the Department of Defense. Because if they're a foreign country, then we should do for them what we did for Panama or Grenada.
Go in there, B-52s.
Pop them from 30,000 feet. Have a big hole in the middle of Montana where they used to
For like 24 hours, just dropping bombs.
So maybe my solution isn't all that good. Anyway, back to the subject of the idea of this rhetoric of hate and fear. It is being used, though, for political purpose. And I don't think it's just accidental. I mean, getting back, I don't think it's conspiratorial necessarily. But I think people who start things sometimes don't realize where they're going to end. Ronald Reagan started this notion of the government is the problem, not the government is the solution to the problem. And when the President of the United States says the government's the problem, then every other group who says, yeah, that's true, they can use the President as an example. And so even though there may be some problems with the government, as far as I can tell, the government's the solution to the problem too, as opposed to being the problem.
Well, basically, when people talk about the private sector, most people in the private sector, when they talk about the economy, they're constantly criticizing the government. Government interference, government interference. And without a government structure, there's nothing you could get done. I mean, how many cars would you have in this country if you didn't have highways, if you didn't have roads? You know, how many airplane companies would you have if you didn't have airports and runways built by the government? You know, but I don't think that's the kind of government they're talking about. But it's the thing to do, you know, to criticize the government, a structure that is necessary for the private sector to do as well as it does in this company, in this country.
That's an interesting slip of tongue, in this company.
And you know where I'm coming from.
I have a cartoon that I had in my office, and it was that Clinton was interviewing for the next CEO of Conglomco for a second term as CEO of Conglomco. And that's sort of the same thing. I mean, without the government structure there would be no ability of the private sector to do what they do, because somebody else would come take their stuff.
Sure.
They just show up and say, okay, we got guns, we're taking your stuff.
Well, there's a longing for simplicity in all of this, I think. A worry about the complexity of the modern world. And they want to live in their own isolated communities and have the relatively simple life that involves, and escape all these ideas of globalism and being part of a global village and all of the complications that modern life has. I mean, the whole trend in modern living is a trend toward globalism and complexity and interconnectedness. These groups represent the kind of last-ditch effort to escape all this, to want to go back to the times of the pastoral lifestyle where you could live in communities.
The Vikings would show up and pillage your village. And
yeah, right. You could go to the next village and pillage and rape and get away with it. And, but you can't do that anymore, right? You can't pillage and rape. You can't enslave another people and make them your captives. That just isn't the way it goes anymore. And there's a kind of longing for
the good old days when slavery was legal.
That kind of idea where everything was decided at the local level, and there wasn't this complicated world that you had to deal with.
Now you got to pay them $4.25 an hour.
Well, that's an interesting thing. Part of this, and part of what intrigued me about the course when we talked about it, is a text you're using, and you might want to show that, which it leads into our later segment too.
Well, for the beginning part of the course, I make use of the book that's called Logic and Mr. Limbaugh. It's a collection of arguments that Rush Limbaugh has presented in some of his written work. And the author of this book, Ray Perkins, analyzes these examples from Limbaugh's literature and shows the logical faults in them, the slips in reasoning and the misstatements that are contained in them. And they're rampant.
Well, but that's the whole point, though, isn't it? That it isn't whether the logic works or whether or not the information is accurate. It's whether or not people already believe that what you say about something being wrong is true.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
We'll keep going on it.
I think when you read this through and you get the overall impression, or even if you read one of Limbaugh's books, you definitely get the impression that he isn't trying to give you cogent reasoning. He's not trying to persuade you of anything. He is, again, just basically restating things that a collection, a group of Americans believe in, and they like to hear stated. They tend often, in fact, to be views that are, to a certain extent, unpopular, or what is sometimes called not politically correct views. And so to hear someone like Limbaugh say them, someone who is articulate, makes it exciting and thrilling to hear him say this thing like environmentalism is bad, and we shouldn't worry about discrimination, and women's rights is a lot of hogwash. All of these kinds of ideas expressed by Limbaugh are fun to hear if you believe that sort of thing, if you believe as he does.
Well, and they just port it, and they move to an area where there may be, again, a kernel of truth about something, And I have this in my classes all the time. People say, well, that's not true. Mount Pinatubo put out more pollution than all of mankind. That's not true. And in fact, that quote was based on another of Lyndon LaRouche's followers who wrote something, and then it was quoted by somebody, and Limbaugh quoted it, and it's simply not true. It talked about an eruption that happened 700,000 years ago. Mount Pinatubo happened a few years ago. And it's just wrong, but people, there was no genocide against the Indians. Native Americans didn't get wiped out because they have people now identified as Native Americans, so they couldn't have genocide. They're still here.
Yeah, Limbaugh has an argument like that. He argues that there are more Native Americans alive today than at the time of Columbus. Therefore, there wasn't genocide. But, that's obviously...
Where does he get his idea that there are more now? There were a couple of 100 million.
Yes. I mean, he plays fast and loose with the facts.
But you remember, they didn't used to count them. Yeah,
Well, they didn't have souls, so it was okay.
So he probably would look back at the census, and they said, well, there's no Indians.
We didn't know they were there. They were hiding in the forest, right? So, we didn't see them.
That's sort of the same as the Columbus discovery thing, where he discovered America. Well, how did he do that? When there were millions of people living here.
The Indians discovered Columbus.
Yeah, we wanted to go out and discover some very valuable properties, put a flag on it.
There's a quote by Twain in his book, Pudd'nhead Wilson. Pudd'nhead Wilson has a calendar, and there's a saying from Pudd'nhead Wilson's calendar at the beginning of each chapter of that book. It's a wonderful book, by the way. And one of the quotes is for October, for Columbus Day. It was a wonderful thing that Columbus discovered America, but it would have been even more wonderful if he hadn't.
It depends on which perspective you're looking at.
Yeah.
And it's tough because we're actually benefiting from the destruction of Native American culture and mass extinction. But that gets us to another topic, and that is we have to do our Dead Skunk in the Road Award for the program. We do that at the end of each program. But before that, you're talking about logic and Mr. Limbaugh. I picked up a copy of Al Franken's new book, Rush Limbaugh is a Big Fat Idiot. And so in terms of this ad hominem attack, he's kind of taking it right to it. And
it's, by the way, just the sort of thing that Limbaugh himself does.
Right, that's why he's doing it.
He does a lot of name calling too.
Yeah. Oh, I beat up on Chelsea Clinton's, and he had a picture of a dog and a picture of Clinton. Said, "Which one's the dog in the White House?" So that leaves him open to be attacked.
Exactly.
Like this. But this guy Franken is actually very bright, and this is a great book. It's really hilarious if you want to get some grins to do that. But it is sort of what you were saying shouldn't be done in terms of logical debate or rhetoric. This isn't rhetoric.
It's just pure fun.
Well, I think
Again, it's
sometimes
preaching to the converted.
Yeah, I think sometimes it's dangerous if you even think that you're going to get in an intellectual debate with Rush Limbaugh. It's just not going to happen because he's just will say anything, make up anything,
and he has
go
the
in any
ability to
direction.
hang you up.
Sure, that's a good ability.
Well, that leads us to our Dead Skunk in the Road Award, and we'll talk about this as we move. Yeah, this is the Stinky Award. We'll talk about this more as we move to our next program. But our Dead Skunk in the Road Award goes to Rush Limbaugh because a couple of things. One is he refuses to debate Al Franken on public television. Yeah, because Al Franken ate his lunch. And second, I'm told that he quit the Republican Party because they passed the minimum wage in Congress. We're running out of time, so we'll stop with that, and we'll pick it up with minimum wage next time. Thanks for watching Roadkill Politics.
Good night.
Bye.